It is now my privilege to introduce Mr. Mogg Morgan, a long-term friend of mine, a practicing occultist, an esotericist. Some have called him a pagan theologian. He is the CEO and founder of Mandrake of Oxford, a revolutionary and cutting-edge specialist press. His specialities, his academic training, as far as I know, was in Southeast Asia, but he has an organic intellectual's compulsion, fascination with the mysteries of Egypt and all things Egyptian, wherein, of course, the Nephilim are mentioned. My dear friend Mogg, I'm handing over the floor to you.
Just sharing my screen. Okay. Hopefully we're running. So the Nephilim then. The Nephilim are supernatural entities first mentioned in the enigmatic biblical passage that David was talking about. Just to remind you, Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of men came unto the daughters of sons of God, rather, came into the daughters of men, and they bore children for them. The same with the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Egyptian background to this biblical passage a little bit more. The name, as David said, means giant, but also I would say the fallen, as in those who fell down from the upper realm, from heaven, but not necessarily fallen down. They may have just gone down. They were the sons of gods or angels who desired to take on a human form, and thus they are half human. Same term is also applied to their offspring of the union between them and human women, which they initiate or, depending on your point of view, they are seduced into. They have supernatural powers. Some are thought of as bad and others are not so bad. From my point of view, they also have a knowledge of magic, which they teach to humanity. They also are said in certain sources to teach metalwork, astronomy, and alchemy, all things which are very interesting from an Egyptian point of view. Sometimes also known as the Gibborim or the Holy Ones. They're also referred to in later sources as the Watchers from the use of the Aramaic word Irim, which also means angels. The angels who fell in love with the daughters of men. Now, in all of these kind of stories, something to do with the Great Flood. There's a memory of the Great Flood comes in. This is something that is remembered from all sources, not just biblical ones, but is well known within the Egyptian tradition, or perhaps, well, not well known, but it will be well known when I tell you about it. Jewish sources say that the Nephilim actually provoked this flood, caused the flood, which was an attempt by the supreme deity to get rid of them in some way, although it didn't work because they survived. Important source and Kabbalistic source on this is the Zohar, and from which we get the names of at least two of them, which are Azza and Azael, who rebelled above and whom the Holy One, blessed be he, caused to fall from heaven, and were forced to put on and live with the garments of the earth, which means they put on human bodies, in other words, which is an important point to bear in mind, because they could not divest themselves of these garments and could not return to their former residence with the rest of the angels, because they've become human. So they remain forever on the earth. Subsequently, they were seduced in this form by earthly women, as the Zohar account, and they exist to this day. They still exist, teaching sorcery to people. They begot sons, which are also called mighty or giants, and David's referred to some of them surviving ones. They're also referred as the sons of Elohim, of God. Now, within the rabbinical tradition, they provide a convenient explanation for the existence of demons within the world, which is as a consequence of the intercourse between the angels and human beings, the sort of intermediary thing. This makes the demons different to how we kind of think about it in Christian tradition. They are kind of intermediaries. They're mediators between the world of humans and the world of the gods, which is very useful within magic or within any tradition. So, okay, my remit is to look at the Egyptian aspect of this. Is there an Egyptian side to this, and I can say, yeah, all of it really. All of it has got an Egyptian background. Primarily, Egypt has a class of beings with a slightly different name called the Shabtui, which means the submerged ones, which obviously links with the idea of the flood. But if you think about submerged as well, it's to kind of come down or to be covered in some way. So the evidence of the flood is to be found everywhere in Egypt. And in fact, there's a text which says, "I will destroy everything that I have created. The earth will return to the noon, which is the waters, as it was in the primordial age. And I am the only one, in fact, who will remain with the god Osiris. And I will turn back into my form, my original form, which is as a snake, as a colossal snake, which is not known by men and is not even seen by the gods." So that is an important inscription that we find from Esna. And take note that it's a giant serpent or serpents fighting, fighting each other, in fact, in the story. Fighting Seth and Typhon Apophis. These sort of things spring to mind. So we have to bear in mind that the biblical account was actually compiled in Egypt, right? Or the Bible itself, right, was put together from Egyptian sources in the famous Library of Alexandria, or certainly the Greek version of the Bible, the translation of the Talmud into Greek was commissioned by Egyptian pharaoh, a Greek-based Egyptian pharaoh, and asked them to use it and allowed them to use local records to do that. And hence the term giant, which when it comes into there. The other problematic thing is the idea of the intercourse between the physical, sexual intercourse between gods and humans, which surprisingly, I suppose not surprisingly, exercised people quite a lot to try and work out how that might be possible. And the idea that gods teach magic, all these are kind of then Egyptian ideas. We could see that they might have sort of flooded into this. And so the idea of intercourse between gods and humans, very Egyptian. The idea that the gods teach magic, you can't think of anything that's more Egyptian than that, really. The alchemy, the presence of alchemy, the invention of alchemy, very Egyptian thing. The early metalwork, which is another kind of thing that you get from the Nephilim. The issue of astronomy, great periods of time, religious astronomy, if you like, very, very Egyptian thing. It's something that they bequeathed and taught to the whole world, really. So we might look at the type of magic, right, that comes from this tradition. And there's lots of things we could we'll refer to. It's a big subject, and probably within the period of time I've got here, I'm not going to be able to go into too much of that. Firstly, though, there's a certain amount of controversy about this term giant. So I was told when I was doing this, and I think this is true. Some people don't like the term, either because they think it's a little bit silly. That's one point of view. But the main controversy, I think, seems to be maybe from a Christian point of view, that this seems to undermine the idea, the existence of these giants and these other sort of semi-divine beings. It undermines the idea of a single all-powerful God. So they don't like this, or some Christians don't like it. I mean, obviously David doesn't mind, but some people take umbrage at this. Who are these other beings, right, that are referred to in the Bible? Even more disturbingly, is this idea that they have intercourse with human beings. It just seems impossible, really. So in a nutshell, without going too much into the linguistic argument, which I did have to do, I can say you just have to accept it. This is the old tradition, and it's not something that was made up last week. When those experts translated the Bible into Greek, the rabbis, this is the word that they chose, and this is the tradition in the land of Egypt that they were writing in. Same can be said for intercourse between humans and gods. This is a very, very Egyptian thing. There are many, many fascinating examples of the connection between gods and humans is within Egypt. And one very famous example that you might look into would be the case of Alexander the Great, who, of course, was said to have a divine paternity. His mother is supposed to have had intercourse with a god. And I could extend this and go into loads and loads of very, very fascinating examples of that. And in popular culture of Egypt, it's a widespread belief now, even certainly in the past, that this thing, maybe we would call it incubi and succubi, or the idea that gods or spirits can visit people in their sleep and have sex with them. The Egyptian magical papyri are full of rituals connected with this, either to counteract it or to kind of make it happen in a way, because it's quite an important part of the magical tradition, interestingly, that we learn from the gods within the Egyptian tradition. Thus, this quote from the Greek magical papyri: "You say that a handsome phantom keeps appearing to your daughter, and this seems unreasonable to you. Yet how many others have fallen in love with unreasonable bodies," in brackets, unreasonable bodies, spirits, really. And Plutarch, who is a Neoplatonist, always has something to say about all this sort of stuff, said the Egyptians make a distinction here that is plausible. While a woman may be approached by a divine spirit and impregnated, oops, there is no such thing as sexual intercourse between a man and a divinity. So, interesting piece of mechanics there. A divine being can have sex with a human female, but not the other way around. Within the Egyptian tradition, there are two main Egyptian sources that we must look at now, which must have been known to the people who translated the Bible into Greek. And this is Manetho, the Egyptian priest, whose name means beloved of Neith. And Neith, the goddess, is very important in this story. He wrote in Greek in the 2nd century BCE, Manetho, and he wrote a history of Egypt going right back in time to what we would call the nameless Eon. And this is before all the famous kings and pharaohs such as Ramesses and all the rest. And it's usually a bit of Manetho that is kind of ignored. And he describes a strange generation of gods, humans, and other beings before the flood as recorded within Egyptian records. His book, the Egyptiaca, has not survived, but it was so famous in the ancient world that the Hellenistic Jews themselves made a copy of this. They rewrote it, in other words, and they did it in such a way that Jewish chronology became compatible with the Egyptian chronology for all sorts of reasons. So we have a clear example here of the Jews at the same time that the Talmud was being translated into Greek, including sections about the Nephilim, that they were already relying heavily on Egyptian sources to put this history together. It's interesting in this record, this first record of Manetho that I'm talking about, the history of Egypt before the flood. It then goes on and it talks about the early pharaohs themselves, and even when it's referring to the human pharaohs, the kings of Egypt that come after the flood, if you like, there's always a reference to the fact that they are taller than everybody else. What's Sesostris, or Senwosret, is said to be 5 cubits and 3 palms in height, which, if you're not familiar with ancient forms of measurement, is very, very tall. It's more than 8 foot tall. So regularly the pharaohs themselves were referred to as tall, and they're the kind of successors to all this stuff. I should say, if you look at the slides, you will see that this is sort of echoed in some of the images of Egyptian things that are always shown on a colossal size. Manetho describes the first man this is in the generations before the flood, in the generations of the Nephilim, if you like. And the Egyptian name, they give it a Greek name, but Egyptian, this would be a god called Atum. Atum is not so different to the name Adam in a way. Atum, Adam. You know, you never know. Anyway, these beings were anonymous divine beings, right, who existed before the flood. And you can say that the numbers together from the first man to the time of the flood, it gives you a period of 25,000 years in this record, which is just a number. But actually, if you know anything about astronomy, that's quite a potent number in itself. It's the total sequence of the precession of the equinoxes through 25,000 years. That's where they get the number from the Egyptian records. After the reign of these semi-divine, half-human, well, they're referred to as gods and humans. That's a weird thing. Later come the rule of the demigods, or also known as the spirits of the dead. The demigods, they are more like into two groups: the followers of Horus, and the spirits of the dead are probably the followers of Set Typhon. The god Set, who is this very ambiguous deity, often viewed as the personification of evil. It could be they're called spirits of the dead because they have very special death customs in the very ancient pre-dynastic times, and are very close to ancestral spirits in the spirit realm in itself. Some would say they practice a form of necromancy, which is an issue probably can't go into too much. If you like, these are the second generation of what we would call the Nephilim, or the Shebtui from the Egyptian terminology. This is all confirmed by other writers of the time as well, you know, such as Plutarch. Again, he said Typhon of old, Typhon being the Greek name, he conquered Osiris and he ruled, right? For Egypt was once a sea, was once under the sea, and there are many, from which cause many places of mines and mountains are found to contain seashells, which you'll see in some of the pictures. And indeed, it is a fact that the Egyptians place these relics all around them, right? You know, they see these relics all around them, as maybe you'll see in the slideshow. The so-called Pyramid Mountain, just outside modern Luxor, actually has a beach of seashells right up on the top of the mountain. There are too many examples to go into, but one notable example would be a thing called the Black Bones of Set. Set again, you see, he comes into this story a lot. I think you have to say Set is one of the Nephilim, really. Many tons of which were found in the tombs of a place called Antiopolis, which is named after the giant Antaeus. Giants come up in this story all the time. Their shiny black color gives them the appearance of iron, and they're ancient relics from the past. So that's Manetho. One more record I'll just quickly mention, if that's all right, which is a book called The Sacred Book of the Primeval Age of the Gods, bit of a mouthful, and is written on the temple walls of the Horus of Edfu. And this is where we learn the name, or the Egyptian name, of the Nephilim, which is the Shebtui. There was once, to tell you a story, a lost submerged kingdom known as the Island of the Tramplin, and later as the Island of Peace, and an ancient conflict took place there according to Egyptian records, and this is before the flood. The island world had a temple, and it had a completely alien set of gods whose names we don't know, but are known collectively as the Shebtui, the submerged or lower ones, which, if you think of it, is not too far from the term Nephilim, which could mean submerged or lower as well. There's not so much fallen from the sky, but the sky has fallen on them. And then darkness is on the face of the island, right? Recognize this. And the primeval waters that surrounded it and submerged it, and for the island was trampled in a cosmic battle, and its ruins lie beneath the sacred waters. This place is also known as the underworld of the soul, and all who lived there were insubstantial ghost-like beings, which explains the intercourse between gods and humans. And of these beings, the Shebtui, two are named, and play a role in raising the island, raising Atlantis, if you like, Atlantis story comes from Egypt, don't forget as well. This is part of it. They used magic spells to raise the island to rebuild the primary mansion. As the ruins, out of the ruins, they rise up the island, and serpent entities come and try to destroy it again, a big battle again, and this time they win. We know the names of these beings as well as we know the names of Azza and Azrael. They're aided in this task by another set of beings called the Seven Sages, which, if you know anything about astronomy, is a very, very provocative term, really, evocative term. In our story, the first sign that the flood is retreating is similar to the story of Noah's Ark. A falcon, this time not lands with a reed or relic. This is very like the account in the flood, where the first sign that the flood is receding in the Bible is when a dove appears with a reed. So the Sheb-Tui, as we know from this story, are the Egyptian equivalent of the Nephilim. As I say, all these stories can be related to the myth of Atlantis. The myth originates from the temple records. It's what you might call deep mythology in Egypt. It doesn't mean one person copied it. It means this is what happened. It talks of the actual creation of the earth, which was the work of a multitude of nameless divine beings. And in this unique account, you can see that they're ghost-like, insubstantial beings. And there are no women amongst them at first. Again, very significant when you think of the story. For one reason or another, the whole lost world of Egypt was submerged beneath a flood, which is one of these old stories that we're kind of reviving. So the Nephilim are the Egyptian gods, if you like, certainly the god, the spirits of the dead and the Typhonians and the god of Set. They come back, they must be kept in the temple, but they don't go out of the temple. They stay within the Egyptian temples. But their power, their magic, their Heka is given to humans to then manipulate outside. So they stay in their temples as sort of a black box, and the humans use their power, manipulated to work magic within Egypt when Egypt existed. Obviously, the first act of magic is the rebuilding of the houses and the temples. And the old temples replicate the first temple, this first ancient building of the Nephilim. So this all plays out into the actual performance of magic, which is still the same. We're still performing in the same way. We're literally, hence it's called theurgy, the work of the gods. We perform the same actions, which is the building of the four-square house up above and below the altar. So, and they start in the center with the hidden god, which is the magician themselves. So any act of magic which the Egyptians learned from their gods and which we've learned from the Egyptians and make our own contact is the equivalent of, is our emulating the work, right, and the action of the Nephilim. Those who taught us astronomy, also the science of the heavens and magic to us. So Egypt is viewed as the temple of the whole world, and the Egyptians and the Hebrews each regarded themselves as the main custodials of this magic within the world, the ancient world, and now within the modern world. And their secrets ultimately came to them from the Nephilim. And the magic they made and taught continues to ripple in the modern world. It has returned. There you go. Hope that's 20 minutes.
Be ye as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves, as gentle as doves. My God, Mogg's a performer. It wasn't that absolutely fascinating. I think everybody knows I'm more than sympathetic to paganism. Let me stress before we get into Q&A, Mogg has written a number of books on these fascinating subjects. And if I'd have had my way, this wouldn't have been a virtual meeting. We'd have actually had a physical base of presence, but basically there were no venue managers that would do what we want because of the lockdown. But we will be holding physical meetings when we can all get together, and I'll be extending the times of all the speakers. Mogg, that was absolutely extraordinary as usual. By the way, before I get to Q&A, look up the other Loch Ness monster, where you'll see Mogg not only performing as a master magician, but acting at his very, very best. I'm sorry, the old showman in me can't resist that reference.